The wind in the high lonesome of the Absarokas did not whistle. It scoured. It came down from the peaks like a sharpened blade, peeling the last of the November chill off the land and replacing it with the hard, blue malice of true winter. Isaac Holt felt it through his wool coat, through his denims, and deep into his bones. His horse, a tough bay gelding named Jethro, lowered its head, flanks heaving. They had been pushing northwest for 3 days since leaving the last settlement, a place that had offered no work and too many questions. Isaac was aiming for the Star K Ranch, tucked up against the foothills, said to be hiring men tough enough to handle the winter drift. Isaac was tough. It was the only thing life had left him. He was a man running from a name. In Wyoming, they called him a killer. It was a lie. Mostly. It had been a saloon fight in Laramie, a card game gone wrong, and a man who drew first but shot second. The sheriff had called it self-defense, but the man's brothers called it murder. Isaac, wanting no part of a feud, had simply ridden north. He carried the reputation like a second coat, heavy and cold. He was 40 miles from the Star K when the sky, which had been a bruised gray all morning, turned a solid, suffocating white. The wind stopped scouring and began to roar. It came not from one direction but from all of them, a blinding chaos of ice and air. The snow was not in flakes, but in sheets, horizontal and dense. Jethro stopped, refusing to move into the wall of white. "Just a bit further, boy," Isaac muttered, his words snatched from his mouth. He squinted, but the world was gone. There was no trail, no mountains, only the swirling void. He knew these storms. They were graves. You kept moving or you died. He dismounted, pulling the horse by the reins, walking into nothing. He was a big man, broad in the shoulder, but the blizzard made him feel like a child. He stumbled, the snow already past his boot tops. He had maybe an hour, maybe less, before the cold took his hands and feet. And then his will. He was thinking of the horse, of the pity of shooting it for warmth, when a shape solidified in the gloom. It was a figure, impossibly small and bent, wrapped in so many shawls it looked like a bundle of rags. It was leading a mule. "You're a fool or you're lost!" the figure shrieked. A woman's voice, cracked with age. "Looking for the Star K," Isaac yelled back. "Star K is 2 days' ride in this. You'll be bones by morning. Come on, if you want to live." She did not wait for an answer. She grabbed Jethro's rein, tugging the horse behind her mule, which seemed to navigate by some unseen sense. Isaac, numb and grateful, followed in their wake. The woman was tiny, but she moved with a grim determination. They walked for what felt like an hour, a brutal, blinding trek. Isaac could no longer feel his cheeks. He just kept his eyes fixed on the gray shape of the mule's rump. Finally, the woman stopped. "Here," she grunted. Isaac looked up. Through the swirl, he saw the dark shape of a cabin. It was small, dug into the side of a low hill, with snow banked high against its walls. A thin, frail ribbon of smoke escaped the stone chimney. "Whose place?" "My son's widow," the old woman said. She banged a frozen mitten against the thick plank door. "Ruth, open up! Got a stray!" The door opened a crack. A sliver of a face appeared, pale, with large, dark eyes. The eyes widened in fear when they saw Isaac, a large, snow-caked stranger. "No," a voice said, thin but hard. "Not here. Auntie Jensen, I can't." "Ruth, don't be a fool," the old woman snapped, pushing the door wider. "It's this or the angels, the storm settling in for a week. You want his ghost haunting you?" The woman, Ruth, shrank back. She looked from the old woman to Isaac, her gaze filled with a desperate, trapped energy. She was thin, her dress worn, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that did nothing to soften the sharp lines of her cheekbones. She was a woman braced against the world. "I have nothing for him," she whispered. "He has himself. That's all that matters tonight. Mrs. Jensen shoved Isaac forward. "Get in, Cowboy! Stamp the snow off!" Isaac, too cold to argue or feel the full weight of the intrusion, stumbled past Ruth into the one-room cabin. It was dark. The only light came from a small hearth where a few logs smoldered, giving off more smoke than heat. The air was frigid. "Auntie, I can't," Ruth said again, her voice rising with panic. "You will, Mrs." Jensen pointed a finger at her. "He stays. You keep the fire. I'm going to my own place before the track's gone. I'll check when the white breaks." She turned and was gone, the door slamming shut with a heavy thud, leaving Isaac and Ruth alone in the sudden, suffocating silence. He stood by the door, melting snow puddling around his boots. She stood by the fire, her back to him, rigid. The cabin was tiny. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall, a rough table and 2 chairs against the other. The space between them was barely 10 feet, but it felt like a canyon. "Ma'am," Isaac said, his voice rough. He pulled off his hat. "I apologize for this. I'd have slept in a drift for I burdened you." She did not turn. "There's no burden. Just stay by the door. The floor is coldest there." It was a dismissal. Isaac accepted it. He was the stray dog let inside, and he knew his place. He unrolled his bedroll near the door, as far from her cot and the hearth as he could get. He sat with his back against the rough logs, pulling his coat tighter. The wind screamed outside, a living thing clawing at the walls. They did not speak for hours. The first day passed in that silence. The storm did not lessen. It deepened. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin. The cold was a physical presence, a third person in the room. It crept from the floorboards and down from the roof. Ruth tended the fire with a miserly precision, adding 1 small log at a time. Isaac watched her movements. She was economical, wasting nothing. When she made coffee, it was thin and bitter, boiled from old grounds. She offered him a cup. He took it. She cut 2 slices of hard bread and handed him one. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, retreating to her chair by the fire, wrapping a thin shawl around her shoulders. She seemed to be trying to make herself invisible. On the second day, the woodpile by the hearth was nearly gone. "Wood's low," Isaac stated. It was not a question. Ruth's shoulders tensed. "It's all I have." "Is there a woodpile outside?" "Behind the cabin, but the drift." "Is there a rope?" She pointed to a coil of worn hemp by the door, without another word. Isaac bundled himself back into his coat, tied one end of the rope around his waist and the other to the iron door latch, and stepped out into the blizzard. Ruth watched the door slam shut. She was alone again, but now she was tethered to the stranger. She sat, her hands clenched, listening to the wind. She hated this. She hated the fear. She had built a small, miserable peace in her isolation, and this man had shattered it just by existing. The town called her the unclean woman, the Black Widow. They whispered she had killed Silas, her husband, for his money. They were wrong about the killing, but right about the hate. She had hated Silas, and when he died, she had felt nothing but the cold. This man brought the world back, and she wanted it gone. After a long time, there was a heavy banging. She rushed to the door, pulling it open against the wind. Isaac fell inside, a human snowdrift, his arms full of logs. He was coated in ice, his beard a frozen mass. He dropped the wood by the hearth and collapsed to his knees, fighting for breath. Ruth stared. He had risked his life for her firewood. She felt a strange, unwelcome prickle of something other than fear. She shut the door and bolted it, then knelt, taking a piece of sackcloth to break the ice from his beard. His hand shot up and grabbed her wrist. It was not a violent grip, but it was steel. His eyes blue and startlingly clear beneath the ice, locked on hers. They were inches apart. "Don't," he said, his voice a low rasp. She froze. He released her wrist, slowly, as if realizing what he had done. "My apologies, ma'am," startled. He turned away, tending to his own frozen face, his back to her. Ruth retreated, her wrist burning where he had held it. The silence was back, but it was different now. It was charged. That night, the second night, the temperature plummeted. The fire, even with the new wood, was a losing battle. The cold was unbearable. Isaac, in his bedroll, shivered violently. Ruth, on her cot, was huddled under every blanket she owned, and still her teeth chattered. Neither slept. They listened to the storm and to the sound of each other's misery. Finally, near dawn, Ruth spoke. Her voice was barely audible over the wind. "You'll freeze solid there." Isaac didn't move. "I'm fine." "You are not. You're shaking the floorboards. Get your roll and put it by the hearth." It was a small concession, but it felt massive. He dragged his bedroll the few feet, laying it on the stone flags in front of the fire. The warmth was immediate, but it put him only 2 yards from her cot. He lay on his back, staring at the smoky ceiling. She lay on her side, facing him. He was watching her in the low, flickering light. He had been watching her for 2 days. Something about her face, the line of her jaw, the deep sadness in her eyes, had been picking at his memory. He had seen her before. And suddenly, in the firelight, he knew. His breath caught. He remembered it was 4 years ago. Not Wyoming, but close to the border. A night thick with smoke and the smell of burning hay and spilled whiskey. He had been drifting, looking for work, and had gotten into a dispute with a local landowner, a brute named Silas Calder. Calder had accused him of cheating at cards. Isaac had left, but Calder and his men had followed, cornering him in the livery. A lantern was knocked over. The dry hay went up like powder. Isaac had fought his way out, but as he ran, he heard a scream, not from Calder, but from the house. A woman, trapped in a burning shed attached to the main barn. He hadn't thought. He had kicked the door in. She was there, in a white nightgown, coughing, surrounded by smoke. He had grabbed her, lifted her. She was light, all frantic bird bones and terror. He remembered the feel of her body pressed against his chest, her hair, unbound, brushing his face. He remembered the smell of her skin beneath the soot. He had carried her clear, setting her down in the wet grass as the barn roof collapsed. Taking Silas Calder and his hired hand with it, he saw the sheriff's posse arriving. He knew how it would look. The gambler, the fire, the dead landowner. He had vanished into the night. He had never known her name. He had only known the feel of her, a memory that had haunted him for 4 years, a moment of strange, desperate intimacy in the middle of death. He looked at the woman on the cot. Ruth Calder, Silas Calder's widow. He was in her house. He was the man who had started the fire that killed her husband. Isaac turned his head, staring into the flames. The blood drained from his face, leaving a cold sickness in his gut. He was not just a killer. He was her destroyer. He was the reason she was here, alone, an outcast. He was the source of her misery. The fear he always carried, the fear of bringing ruin to anything he touched, became a suffocating certainty. He was a plague. Ruth had been watching him. She saw the change, his stillness, the sudden, raw intensity of his gaze before he looked away. It was a look that stripped her bare. She sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest. "What is it? What are you looking at?" Isaac kept his eyes on the fire. "Nothing, ma'am, just the cold." But she knew it was a lie. She looked at him, truly looked at him. The weathered face, the beard thick with ice, but the eyes, she had seen those eyes. Her memory, a box she kept locked and buried, flew open. The smoke, the heat, the terrifying roar of the fire. Silas screaming her name, not in rescue, but in rage. And then the door splintering. A large man, a stranger. The feeling of being lifted, of being safe for one impossible second. She remembered the scratch of a wool coat and the steady beat of a heart against her ear. She remembered the eyes, blue and fierce, illuminated by the flames, just before he set her down and disappeared. It was him. She made a small, strangled sound. This was the man from the fire, the man who had saved her, the man who was there the night her husband died, the night she had locked the shed door from the inside, praying the fire would take him before he could unlock it and get to her. She stared at him, horrified. He was not a stranger. He was a ghost. He was her guilt, given flesh and blood, sitting by her fire. "You," she breathed. Isaac tensed, but did not look at him. "Ma'am?" "Get back to the door," she said, her voice shaking, sharp as glass. Isaac looked at her. Their eyes met, and in that instant, everything was known, the fire, the smoke, the death. He did not argue. He did not speak. He picked up his bedroll. The few feet of warmth he had gained now forfeit, and moved back to the cold floor by the door. Ruth turned her back to him, pulling the blankets over her head. But the cabin was no longer just cold. It was full. It was full of the past, full of guilt, and full of the man who had held her in his arms while her husband burned. They both lay awake, eyes wide open in the darkness, listening to the storm. They were two outcasts, two souls marked by the same night, trapped together by the snow, each terrified of the other, and even more terrified of themselves. The recognition hung in the cabin. A second, colder storm. The air, already thin, became sharp and hard to breathe. They did not speak of it. To speak of the fire, of the smoke and the death, was to give it a power they could not control. So they said nothing. Isaac moved back to the door. Ruth stayed on the cot. The blizzard shrieked, mocking their silence. The third day dawned gray and hopeless, the small window a solid white rectangle. The cabin was a tomb. The last of the bread was gone. Eaten in silence, they were left with half a sack of beans, some coffee, and a little salt. The scarcity of food was a new intimacy, a forced sharing that was almost as bare as touching. Ruth boiled a small pot of beans. She divided them onto 2 tin plates. His portion was larger than hers. "Ma'am, I can't," Isaac said, his voice a low rumble. "Eat it," she said. Her voice was flat, without negotiation. "You're a large man. You need more. I am used to less." He looked at the beans, then at her. He saw the pride in the straight line of her back. This was not a plea. It was a command. He ate. He saw the cabin through new eyes, not just as a widow's refuge, but as a place of grim survival. He saw where she had patched the chinking with mud and grass. He saw the single shelf with 3 books, their spines broken. He saw the worn place on the floor where she must have knelt to pray, or perhaps just to scrub. He was the man who had put her here. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing on his chest. Ruth felt his eyes on her, and it was worse than the cold. He was not just a stranger now. He was the man who had held her, the only man besides Silas who had ever put his hands on her with strength. One had meant to kill her, the other had saved her. But both moments were tangled in the same night of smoke and ruin. She hated him for seeing her in her nightgown, covered in soot. She hated him for being the one to witness her absolute terror. And she hated him for the memory of his heart beating against her ear. It had been steady. "The wood is low again," he said, his voice pulling her from the memory. She nodded, not looking at him. "There's not much left in the pile." "I'll go. The rope won't reach the trees." "I'll stay close." He pulled on his coat, checked the axe, and stepped back into the white. Ruth watched the door close. She began to pace. The room was too small. Only 3 strides from the hearth to the door. She went to the shelf. The books were Shakespeare, a Bible, and a book on Roman history. They were her father's. She had been a teacher. She had taught children in Helena how to read, how to write their names. She had been proud. She had worn clean dresses and walked with her head high. Then she had married Silas Calder. He was rich and she was poor, and her father had been sick. Silas had seemed kind at first. Then the kindness left, and the cruelty came. He liked to tell her she was worthless. He liked to remind her that he owned her, the same as he owned his horses. The town, they whispered she was unclean. They said it at the general store when she went for flour. They said she had driven Silas mad, that she was cold and barren. And when he died in the fire, their suspicion turned to quiet certainty. They blamed her. She, Ruth Calder, was the reason for it all. And, in a way, she had locked the shed door. She had heard him pounding, screaming her name, and she had not moved. The wind hammered the cabin. Isaac had been gone too long. She clenched her hands. Why did she care? Let the storm take him. He was the start of it. If he hadn't been there, if he hadn't fought with Silas, if he hadn't knocked over that lamp. But he had also pulled her from the smoke. She was by the door, her hand on the bolt, when it burst open. He fell in, just as he had before. But this time the axe clattered from his grip. He was not carrying wood. He was clutching his left forearm, and a dark stain was spreading through the sleeve of his coat. "The wind," he gasped, leaning against the log wall. "Took the axe." She saw the gash. It was deep. The cold had kept it from bleeding much at first, but now, in the relative warmth of the cabin, the blood began to well, dark and thick. The teacher, the woman who had been took over, the widow, the outcast, receded. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to the chair by the hearth. "It's just a—" "Sit down. Take off your coat." He obeyed. He was clumsy, his right hand trying to help his left. She pulled the wet, heavy wool coat from his shoulders. His shirt beneath was soaked with snow and blood. "The shirt, too," she said, her voice sharp. She did not want to do this. She had to. He fumbled with the buttons, his fingers stiff with cold and pain. He swore, low and frustrated. "Let me," she said. She knelt before him. Her fingers brushed his. They were ice. His were shaking. She undid the buttons, one by one. The worn flannel parted. She pulled it from his shoulders. Isaac Holt was a broad man, his chest and arms thick with the muscle of hard work. A scar, white and old, ran from his collarbone down his ribs. He sat, bare-chested in the flickering firelight, breathing hard, looking at the floor. He was ashamed. "It needs cleaning," Ruth said, her voice softer. She went to the pot on the hearth and poured steaming water into a bowl. She took the last clean piece of linen she owned, a scrap from a bed sheet. She came back and knelt. She dipped the cloth. "This will sting," she said. He nodded, his jaw tight. She pressed the hot, wet cloth to the wound. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath, but he did not move. She cleaned the gash, her touch firm and practiced. The gash was long, from his wrist to his elbow, but it was clean. The axe had been sharp. She had to stop the bleeding. She had nothing for a bandage. She stood, turned her back to him, and lifted the hem of her heavy wool skirt. She ripped a long, clean strip from her petticoat. When she turned back, he was watching her. His eyes were not on her hands. They were on her face. The look in them was open, stripped of defense. It was a look of raw gratitude. It unnerved her more than his anger would have. She began to wrap his arm, starting at the wrist. Her fingers moved over his skin. It was warm. She could feel the pulse in his wrist, strong and steady, just as his heart had been against her ear. Her hand, wrapping the cloth, brushed against the hard plane of his chest. He flinched. She pulled her hand back as if burned. The air in the cabin changed. The wind outside, the cold, the hunger. It all vanished. There was only the sound of the fire crackling and the space between her hand and his skin. It was a space of inches, but it held the fire, the smoke, and 4 years of loneliness. She finished the bandage, tying it off with a firm knot. Her hands were shaking. "Thank you," he said. His voice was a rasp. She stood abruptly, moving back to the fire, putting the pot back on the hook. She needed the distance. "You were a teacher," he said. She froze, her back to him. "How do you know?" "The way you move, the way you give orders, the books." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I was in Helena, a long time ago." "It's a good thing, to teach." "It's over," she said, her voice hard. "I'm not that woman anymore." "What woman are you?" She turned on him, her eyes blazing with a sudden, cold anger. "I am the woman they whisper about in town. I am the woman who lives alone because no decent person will speak to her. I am the woman whose husband died in a fire you were at." It was said. The words were out, hanging between them, terrible and sharp. Isaac stood up. He was a large, wounded man, and he seemed to fill the small cabin. He did not look angry. He looked broken. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet. I was there." You fought with him." "I did." "You knocked over the lamp." He looked at her, and the truth was in his eyes, plain and awful. "I did. It was an accident, but it was me." She stared at him. This was it, the confession, the man who had ruined her. She should hate him. She should scream, rage, tell him to get out, to die in the storm. But all she felt was a vast, aching emptiness. The anger wouldn't come. She just felt tired, so very tired. "He was going to kill me," she whispered, the words coming out before she could stop them. "He had the door locked. He said he would teach me a lesson. He was drunk." Isaac's face went pale. "What, he locked you in?" "In the shed, where I slept. When he was bad, I locked it back, from my side. He was in the main barn. When the fire started, I heard him yelling. He couldn't get to me, and I didn't unlock my door." They stared at each other. Two confessions, two killers, of a kind. He, the man who started the fire by accident. She, the woman who let it burn by choice. The storm raged. The fourth night fell, and it was the coldest yet. The wind found every crack in the cabin. The fire was dying, the last of the wood sputtering in the hearth. The temperature in the room was plummeting. The water in the bucket by the door had a thick crust of ice. Ruth was on the cot, under every blanket, and she was shaking so hard her bones ached. Isaac was by the door, his good arm wrapped around his bandaged one. His body curled tight. His shivering was a violent, uncontrolled tremor. "We are going to die," Ruth said, her voice a small, chattering sound. Isaac didn't answer. He was trying to control his breathing. "We will be frozen by morning," she said again, "like statues." "I've been colder," he lied. "No, you have not. No one has." She sat up. The movement sent a wave of agonizing cold over her. "Get your bedroll." "Ma'am." "Get your bedroll. Put it on the cot. There is no other way." He stared at her. "Ruth, I can't." "My name is Mrs. Calder," she snapped, the teacher's voice returning. "And you will do as I say, or you will freeze, and I will be trapped in here with your body. Now, move." He staggered to his feet, a slow, painful movement. He brought his bedroll. It was thin. Her cot was narrow, barely wide enough for one. "Put it down. Get in," she ordered. He laid the roll on the blankets and, with a deep reluctance that matched her own, he lay down on top of it, his back to her. She lay down, facing his back. The cot sagged. Their bodies touched, from shoulder to hip. It was a shock. The heat from his body was intense. A furnace. He smelled of pine and smoke and blood. He was solid. He was real. She was small, and she was trembling. He could feel her tremors through his coat. They lay rigid, back to back, for an hour. The shivering subsided. The brutal, killing cold was replaced by a different kind of tension. He felt the curve of her spine against his. He felt the softness of her hair, which had come unbound and was brushing his neck. She felt the wall of his back. It was a fortress. She was pressed against a man for the first time in 4 years. Not in violence, not in anger, but in shared, desperate survival. The wind howled. The fire sputtered its last. The cabin was plunged into near total darkness. Slowly, as if in a dream, Isaac turned. He moved his wounded arm, grunting with the pain, and shifted his weight. He was facing her. Ruth's breath caught. She did not move. She lay on her back, staring up at the roof she could not see. She could feel him, inches away, looking at her. "Ruth," he whispered. His voice was thick. She turned her head. They were face to face in the dark. Their breath mingled, a small white cloud between them. He was so close. The guilt, the fire. It was all there, but something else was there, too. A raw, aching loneliness that matched her own. "Don't," she whispered. He didn't listen. He leaned closer. He was going to kiss her. She saw the shadow of his head moving. She felt the warmth of his face. "No," she said, but her voice broke. His hand, his good hand, came up. It was rough, calloused. He touched her cheek. She flinched, but she did not pull away. His thumb moved, brushing a tear she hadn't known she'd shed. "Please," she moaned. It was not a no. It was a plea. He misunderstood. He thought she meant him. He thought she was afraid of him. The killer, the brute. His hand moved from her face to the collar of her heavy wool dress. His fingers fumbled with the top button. She panicked. It was too fast. It was too much. It was the barn, the smoke, the feeling of being trapped. "Please, take it off first," she gasped, her hands flying up to grip his wrist. He froze. "What?" "The dress," she cried, her voice muffled. I can't breathe. Take it off." She was not inviting him. She was suffocating in her own armor. She was still the woman in the fire, trapped. Isaac pulled back as if she had struck him. He saw it, the sheer, blind panic in her eyes. It was the same look she'd had in the shed. He was doing it again. He was the man in the smoke. He was the brute. "No," he said, his voice a low growl of self-disgust. "No, I won't." He sat up, swinging his legs off the cot. The cold hit him like a physical blow. He stood over her. She looked up at him, a small, terrified shape in the dark. "I won't be him, Ruth," he said. "I won't be that man." He was breathing hard. He needed to stop this. He needed to stop himself. He needed to stop her, because he knew, in that moment, that her panic was mixed with a desperate, wild need. She had led him here, as much as he had led himself. He saw the leather thong that had tied his bedroll. He grabbed it. Ruth's eyes widened. What are you doing?" He sat on the edge of the bed. He took her left wrist. His touch was not rough, but it was absolute. She did not resist. She was frozen. "Give me your hand," he said. She did. He looped the leather thong around her wrist, pulled it to the wooden bed frame, and tied it. It was not tight. It was just secure. He did the same with her right hand. She was anchored, her arms spread, tied to the head of the cot. Isaac stood up. He looked down at her. She was his captive, and she was safer than she had been all night. He lay back down on the cot, on his own side, his back to her. The space between them was only 6 inches, but it was a canyon. Ruth lay there, her hands bound. She could not move. She could not touch him. She could not pull him closer, and she could not push him away. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He did not turn. His voice came from the darkness, rough and full of pain. "Because we are two people," he said, "not animals, and we are not ready to face what we are." No one slept. The wind screamed. The cabin was filled with the sound of their breathing. Ruth lay, her wrists tied, feeling the pull of the leather. It was not a violation. It was, in some terrible, twisted way, the first time she had felt safe in years. She could feel the heat of his body, just inches away. She could smell him. She lay there, bound and aware, every nerve alive. He lay beside her, rigid, his eyes open, fighting a war with himself. It was a gentle torture, and it lasted until the gray, frozen light of the 5th day. The world returned in stages. First, the silence, the wind, which had been a screaming, living entity for 5 days, was suddenly gone. Its absence was a physical blow, a vacuum that left the ears ringing. Second, the light. A pale, watery gray seeped through the snow-caked window. It was not the light of a storm, but the flat, exhausted light of a world buried. Isaac stirred first. He was on his back, his body a map of aches. The cot was too small. His arm throbbed, and the cold had settled deep in his joints. He was acutely aware of Ruth beside him. She was on her side, facing away, her hands still bound to the bedframe. He did not know if she was asleep. He did not think so. He slid off the cot, his boots hitting the frozen floor with a quiet thud. The cabin was impossibly cold, colder now without the shared heat. He moved to the hearth, his body stiff. He used the last of the kindling and 2 small logs to resurrect the fire. The small flames were a comfort, a weak pulse in the dead room. He stood and turned. Ruth was watching him. Her eyes were dark in the gray light, full of shadows. She did not speak. She just lay there, anchored, waiting. The morning ritual was now a thing of unbearable tension. He had to untie her. He felt like a brute, like Silas, like the very man he had sworn he would not be. He walked to the cot. He was a large man, and his shadow fell over her. She did not flinch. He knelt. His thick, rough fingers fumbled with the leather thongs. His good hand worked at the knots, which had tightened in the cold. He focused on the task, on the leather, on the wood of the bed frame. He could not look at her face. He smelled the scent of her, a faint, clean scent under the smell of smoke and fear. He freed her right hand, then her left. She did not move immediately. She lay there for a moment, her hands resting on the blanket where they had been tied. Then, slowly, she brought them to her chest, rubbing her wrists. There were faint, red marks on her pale skin. Isaac stood up and backed away, retreating to the safety of the hearth. "The storms broke," he said, his voice a low gravel. Ruth sat up, pulling the thin blanket around her shoulders. She looked small and frail, her hair a wild tangle around her face. "Yes," she said. Her voice was a whisper. I'll be moving on. To the Star K, thank you for the shelter, ma'am." He began to gather his things, rolling his bedroll with his one good hand. It was an awkward, clumsy motion. Ruth watched him. She watched him fight with the buckles. He was leaving. He was the man who had seen her in the fire, and the man who had seen her in the dark. He had seen her terror, and he was the only person on earth who knew the truth of her marriage. Even if he did not know the specifics, he was the only person who knew the truth of her hands. The cabin, which had been a prison, suddenly felt too large, too empty. The thought of being alone again, with the silence and the judgment, was a new kind of cold. She wanted to say, "Stay." The words were in her throat, a physical lump, but her pride, the last thing Silas had not beaten out of her, would not let them out. She was Ruth Calder, the town pariah. She did not beg. Isaac finished with his bedroll. He picked up his coat. He looked at the cabin, his gaze landing on the roof. "The snow is heavy," he said, talking to the logs in the wall. "When it melts, it'll come through. The chinking's gone in the north corner." Ruth just nodded, clutching the blanket. "I know." He put his coat down. "A man ought to repay his keep. I can't leave you with a roof set to cave in, and your wood pile is gone. I'll stay. I'll fix the roof. I'll stock your wood." He did not look at her as he said it. He was giving her an out. He was giving himself an out. Ruth's relief was so profound it made her dizzy. She dipped her head, hiding her face. "If you wish, I can't pay you." "Shelter was payment enough," he said. And so he stayed. The cabin became a different place. The storm had been an intimacy of desperation. This was an intimacy of choice. Isaac was a man of quiet, constant motion. He was not built for idleness. The day after the storm, he was outside, the world a blinding, brilliant white under a sharp blue sky. He spent the morning clearing a path, his face set, his breath pluming. Ruth watched him from the window. He moved with a heavy, wounded grace. He favored his left arm, but he did not stop. He took the axe and went into the trees. The sound of his chopping was a steady, rhythmic heartbeat in the silent world. It was a comforting sound. It was the sound of a man working. Silas had never worked. He had only yelled and broken things. Isaac worked all day. He restocked the woodpile, higher than it had ever been. He climbed onto the low roof, his boots slipping on the snow, and began the slow work of clearing the heavy drifts, checking the sod and shingles beneath. Ruth, inside, found herself tending to him. She made coffee, real coffee, from a small stash she had been saving. She gave him the last of the beans for a midday meal. When he came in at dusk, shaking with cold and exhaustion, his bandage soaked through, she had hot water ready. She did not ask. She simply pointed to the chair. "Sit." He sat. She unpinned the bandage. The gash was clean, but it was raw. She cleaned it again, her touch businesslike. He sat, bare-chested by the fire, watching her. The silence from the night of the binding was still there, but it was softer now. "You'll lose the use of that arm if you don't rest it," she said, her voice sharp. "The roof needs doing," he said. "The roof can wait a day." "No, it can't." He was a stubborn man. She was a stubborn woman. She finished the bandage, pulling it tight. "You're a fool, Isaac Holt," she said. He looked up, surprised. It was the first time she had used his name. "And you, Ruth Calder," he said, his voice quiet, "are a better nurse than I deserve." The next day, he took his rifle and went hunting. He was gone for hours. Ruth found herself pacing again. The cabin too quiet, the sound of the axe gone. She strained her ears, listening for a shot, for the sound of his return. She told herself it was only the food. They had nothing left but salt. He returned near sunset, a brace of rabbits hanging from his belt. That night, for the first time in what felt like a year, they ate meat. The stew was hot and rich. They ate sitting at the small table, facing each other. The shared meal, earned by his labor and prepared by hers, felt more intimate than the cot. "This is good," he said, soaking the last of the gravy with a piece of hardtack. "It's just rabbit." "It's more than I've had in a month," he said. They talked, not of the fire, not of the binding. They talked of the snow. He told her about the drifts, how high they were. He told her about the deer tracks he'd seen. She told him about her father, the teacher in Helena. She told him about the books on her shelf. She spoke of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. He listened. He just listened. He was a good listener, his eyes steady on her face. This fragile peace lasted for 2 days. On the 3rd day after the storm, the outside world knocked. It was Mrs. Jensen. She stomped the snow off her boots, her old face a bundle of wrinkles and worry. Her eyes went straight to Isaac, who was mending a chair leg by the fire. "Still here," she observed, her tone flat. Fixing the roof, Ruth said, her voice defensive. Mrs. Jensen accepted the cup of coffee Ruth offered. She warmed her hands, her gaze darting between them. Well, you're the talk of the town. What's left of it, strangers and widows. It's unseemly. It was the storm, Auntie. Ruth said, The storm's been over for 3 days, the old woman countered. She lowered her voice, her expression turning grim. That's not what I'm here for, child. There's trouble, real trouble. Ruth felt the familiar cold grip her stomach. What trouble? That new sheriff, the one from down south, he's been talking to folks, talking to Jed Grimes and that lot. Jed Grimes had been Silas's foreman, a cruel man who now ran the saloon. They're stirring things up. Ruth, saying Silas's death was too convenient, saying he had enemies. Isaac stopped his work. His hands, holding the chair leg, went still. They're saying, Mrs. Jensen continued, her voice barely a whisper, that a wife who didn't mourn proper and who inherited a cabin she had no right to might know more than she's letting on. They're saying it might have been murder. Ruth sat down heavily. That's madness. It's talk, child, but it's dangerous talk. Sheriff's planning on riding up. Soon as the pass is clear, maybe tomorrow, to ask questions. And to see the property, Grimes is saying Silas owed him money, that the cabin should be his. The old woman finished her coffee and stood. You be careful. Ruth, this man. She jerked her chin at Isaac. Having him here, it doesn't look right. It looks like you've got a protector, and people will ask why you need one. She left. The door closed, and the silence she left behind was heavy and full of fear. Ruth stared at the door. They were coming. The world she had hidden from was coming to her. Let them come, Isaac said, his voice low. You've done nothing. Ruth turned to him. Her face was as white as the snow outside. She began to laugh, a dry, terrible sound. Done nothing? I've done everything, Isaac. Ruth. No, don't you say I'm innocent. She was shaking, her hands clenched in her lap. She's right. They're all right. I did want him dead. She stood up and began to pace, the same 3 steps she had paced during the storm. You think he was just a mean man. You think he hit me. He did, but it was more. It was so much more. The words poured out of her. The confession she had held for 4 years. He was tired of me. I gave him no sons. He said I was barren, cold, useless. Her voice broke. The week before the fire, a man came, a merchant from Virginia City. Rich, Silas. Silas made a deal. He was going to sell me to him. Isaac stood up. He what? Sell me, she whispered, the word tasting like ash. Like a horse. He said a man like that. He wouldn't mind that I was used. He'd just want a woman in his bed. Silas was going to be paid $500. She was crying now, silent, angry tears that ran down her face. That night, the night of the fire, he was drunk. He was celebrating. He was packing for me. He grabbed me. He told me I had to be ready for my new master. I fought him. I ran to the shed where I'd been sleeping. It was the only place with a lock on the inside. She looked at him, her eyes wide, haunted. I locked the door. He was pounding on it. He was screaming. He said he'd kill me before he let me defy him. And then I smelled the smoke, and I heard the fire. She stopped, breathing hard. He started screaming a different way. He was calling my name. He was begging, and I sat there. Isaac, I sat there on my cot, my hands over my ears, and I listened. I listened to him burn. I listened to him die, and I did not move. I did not unlock the door. So, you see, I am a murderer. She collapsed onto the chair, her body racked with sobs. Isaac stood by the hearth. He was frozen. He looked at this small, broken woman. He thought of his own guilt, the heavy, stupid guilt of a bar fight, of a knocked-over lamp. It was nothing. It was air compared to this. He was the man who had lit the match, but she was the one who had been tied to the stake. He walked to her. He did not kneel this time. He just stood, looking down at her. His face was a mask of old pain. "Ruth," he said. She looked up, her face streaked with tears. "I didn't just knock over the lamp," he said, his voice thick. "I was in the livery. Silas and his men, Jed Grimes included. They'd followed me from the saloon. They were going to kill me. They said I'd cheated. They said I'd pay. We fought. I hit Grimes with a shovel. I hit Silas. He went down. The lamp. It wasn't just knocked over. I threw it. I threw it at the hay. I wanted a distraction. I wanted to escape." He looked at his hands, his good hand, his bandaged one. "I set the fire. Ruth, I did it on purpose. I didn't know he was in the barn. I didn't know anyone was in the barn. I didn't know. I didn't know you were in the shed. I ran, and I didn't look back." They stared at each other. The twin confessions hung in the air. He, the man who set the fire to save his own life. She, the woman who let it burn to save hers. They were both murderers. They were both survivors. Ruth's sobs subsided. She looked at him, really looked at him. The outlaw, the killer, the man she had been afraid of. You saved me," she whispered. "If you hadn't come." I came for myself," he said, the words full of self-loathing. I heard you scream. But you opened the door. "And I left you. I left you in the grass, and I ran." They were two halves of the same awful night. Two villains in the same story. They had, together, killed Silas Calder. And in that shared, terrible truth, they were bound more tightly than they had been on the cot. They were the same. They were the outcasts. They were the unclean. The realization settled over them, not as a weight, but as a strange, shared identity. They were kin. Night fell. The cabin was silent. They had not eaten. They had not moved. The fire burned low. He was by the door, in his bedroll. She was on the cot. The distance between them was a chasm of their shared sin. "He was going to sell you," Isaac said into the darkness. "Yes." "And Grimes? Grimes was there." "Yes." Isaac was quiet for a long time. "He's not coming for the cabin. Ruth, he's not coming to ask questions. He's coming to finish it. He's coming to make sure the only other person who knows what happened in that barn stays quiet." Ruth's blood ran cold. "Me?" "Us," Isaac said. "If he finds me here." He stood up. He walked through the darkness, his feet sure on the floor. He stopped at her cot. She sat up, clutching the blanket. He knelt beside her, in the faint, dying glow of the embers. His face was all shadows and angles. He looked old and sad. "We are a terrible pair," he whispered. "Yes," she said. He reached out his good hand, not in desire, not in anger, but in a gesture of profound, weary understanding. He laid his palm against her cheek. His hand was rough, calloused, but it was warm. "You're not a monster, Ruth," he said. "You were a woman in a trap. You stopped it from closing." She leaned into his hand. "And you?" "I was a fool, running from a fight. I'm tired of running." She looked at him, at his mouth, so close. He was the man who had started the fire. He was the man who had pulled her from it. He was her ruin, and he was her salvation. She leaned forward. He leaned in. Their first kiss was not about lust. It was not about passion. It was slow, and it was deeply, deeply sad. It tasted of salt, of her tears, and of wood smoke. It was a kiss of shared guilt, of absolution. It was a kiss that said, I see you. I know what you did, and I am the same. He was forgiving her for her part in the fire. She was forgiving him for his. When they parted, they were both breathing shakily. The air between them had changed. Again. The forgiveness had unburdened them. But underneath it, the thing they had fought, the thing he had bound her to prevent, was still there. It was stronger now. He started to pull away. He was the man who lost control. He was the man who threw the lamp. He was afraid of himself. "Isaac," she said. He stopped. She reached down, her hand finding the leather thong he had used on her. It was still on the floor by the cot. She picked it up. "Your hands," she said. He looked at her, confused. "What?" "Give me your hands." Her voice was not the teacher's voice. It was something else, something quiet and strong. He held them out, his right hand, strong and calloused, his left hand, bandaged and wounded. She took them, she put them together, and with a deft, sure movement, she wrapped the leather thong around his wrists. She did not tie him to the bed, she just bound his hands together, a loose symbolic tie. He looked at his hands, then at her. "I'm not afraid of you, Isaac," she whispered. "But you are afraid of yourself. You don't have to be." "Not with me." She was in control. She was the one who was whole. She leaned in and kissed him again. This time, it was not for forgiveness. It was deep, and it was hungry. It was 4 years of loneliness, of fear, of being an outcast. It was the heat of the fire, and the cold of the snow, and the simple, desperate human need to be touched by someone who knew the very worst of you and did not turn away. He was her captive, and for the first time, he was truly free. The morning broke with a heavy, pregnant silence. Isaac woke from a state that was not sleep, his body coiled and aching. His hands, bound loosely at his lap, were numb. Ruth was already awake. She was sitting in the chair by the hearth, where the fire had burned down to smoking embers. She was just watching him, her face unreadable in the gray light. He sat up, the leather thongs pulled taut. She stood, and for a moment he thought she would leave him tied. A strange, fleeting power dynamic passed between them, but she just picked up the small knife she used for vegetables, walked to the cot, and sawed through the leather. It fell away. He rubbed his wrists. They were chafed. "My thanks," he said. "Do not thank me," she said, her voice flat. She turned her back to him and began to make coffee, her movements stiff and precise. "They will come today." "I know." He stood, pulling his shirt straight. The confessions of the night, the forgiveness, the desperate, hungry kiss, it all felt like a dream. The cold light of morning made it unreal. All that was real was the coming threat. He pulled on his boots. He took his gun belt from the peg where it hung and strapped it to his waist. The weight of the pistol was a familiar, grim comfort. "There must be no guns," Ruth said, her back still to him. "This is my home. You are my guest. I will speak." "Ruth, these are not men who listen to women." "They will listen to this one," she said. They drank the coffee in silence. Every snap of a frozen branch outside made them jump. The waiting was a torment. It was just past 10 in the morning when the sound came. 2 horses, moving slow, picking their way through the melting snow. Isaac moved to the window, pushing the rough curtain aside a crack. "It's them, the sheriff, and a man in a black coat." "The preacher," Ruth breathed, her hand going to her throat. "Reverend Gideon." "Stay behind me," Isaac said. "No." She walked to the door and stood beside it, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "This is my house." The knock was heavy, official. Ruth opened the door. Sheriff Brody was a thick man with a walrus mustache and cold, flat eyes. The tin star on his chest was dull. Reverend Gideon was his opposite, thin, pale, with soft, damp-looking hands clasped over his belly. He smiled, but the smile did not touch his eyes. "Mrs. Calder," the Reverend said, his voice a smooth, false balm. "My child, we came as soon as we heard. We were concerned." "Concerned, Reverend?" Ruth's voice was steady. "A woman, alone," Brody said, his voice a low growl. He was not looking at Ruth. He was looking at Isaac, who stood by the hearth, his hand resting near his gun, and apparently not alone. "This is Mr. Holt," Ruth said. "He was caught in the storm." "Storm's been over near 4 days. Holt," Brody said, stepping inside. The preacher followed, bringing a smell of damp wool and false piety into the small room. The cabin shrank, suddenly crowded and dangerous. "Mr. Holt is a friend," Ruth said. "A new friend, I take it," Gideon said, his eyes sliding over the narrow cot, the 2 tin plates on the table, the man's coat on the peg. "Mrs. Calder, Ruth, your reputation." "My reputation is my own affair, Reverend," Ruth said. Brody unbuttoned his coat. He was all business. "We ain't here for pastoral care, ma'am. We're here on a legal matter. Seems your late husband, Silas, had some debts." Ruth's blood went cold, just as Isaac had predicted. "What debts?" Brody pulled a sheaf of folded papers from his coat pocket. "A note owed to Mr. Jed Grimes for $500, dated 2 weeks before his accident. Seems this cabin and the land it's on was the collateral." "That is a lie," Ruth said, her voice shaking. "Silas, he signed it, ma'am," Brody said, tapping the paper. "Grimes wants his due. He's filed a claim, as Silas has no issue, and you are merely the widow. The property reverts to the creditor in lieu of payment." "You are here to throw me out," Ruth whispered. The floor seemed to fall away. "We are here to enforce the law," Brody said flatly. "You have until sundown tomorrow to gather your personals." "No," Ruth said. "Ma'am, don't make this difficult." "No." She took a step forward. She was terrified. She was shaking. But she was also the woman who had listened to her husband burn. She was done being pushed. She looked at Isaac. His face was a mask, his eyes on the sheriff, waiting. He was ready to draw. He was ready to kill for her, or die for her. And she knew, in that instant, that it would solve nothing. It would only make them both outlaws, hunted and dead. She had to use the law, just as they were. "You are mistaken, Sheriff," Ruth said, her voice finding a new, strange strength. "I have the papers. The papers are void." Brody narrowed his eyes. "How do you figure?" Ruth took a breath. She looked straight into the sheriff's cold eyes. "Because the property does not belong to the widow. It belongs, or it will belong, to the husband, to my new husband." Isaac went rigid. He did not move, did not breathe. The preacher gasped, a small, shocked sound. "Mrs. Calder, what blasphemy is this?" "It is not blasphemy, Reverend. It is fact." She turned, took the 2 steps to Isaac's side, and did the only thing she could. She slid her cold, trembling hand into his. His hand, his strong, calloused, right hand. It closed around hers, a vice of strength. "This is Isaac Holt," Ruth said, her voice ringing in the small cabin. "My fiancé. We are to be married." The sheriff's composure broke. He stared at their joined hands. "Fiancé? That changes the claim, doesn't it, Sheriff?" Ruth pressed, her mind working with a desperate, cold clarity. "The debt cannot be collected from the widow if she is remarrying. The property becomes part of a new household. You know the law." Brody looked at the papers, then at Isaac. He saw a man who was not afraid, a man with a gun, A man who was now, by law, the protector of the claim. This is highly irregular, Gideon sputtered, wringing his soft hands. Love is often irregular. Reverend, Ruth said, but it is not illegal. Brody's face was dark. He was beaten. For now. When is the wedding? Ruth did not hesitate. Soon. We were hoping perhaps you would officiate, Reverend, as you were so concerned for my soul. The preacher paled. The trap was sprung. Brody grunted. He folded the papers and shoved them back into his coat. This ain't over, ma'am. Grimes won't like this, and I'll be checking the registry in town. This marriage, it had better be real. It is as real as your concern for my welfare. Sheriff, Isaac said. His first words. His voice was a low growl that vibrated with menace. Brody's eyes met his. It was a silent promise of future violence. The sheriff turned and stomped out of the cabin. The preacher gave Ruth a look of profound disappointment, a final, moral condemnation, and then scuttled out after him. They listened to the horses ride away. The door was still open. A cold, damp wind blew in. Ruth's hand was still in Isaac's. His grip was painfully tight. She pulled her hand away. The silence that fell was 1,000 times heavier than the one before they arrived. The lie was a living thing in the room. It was huge, and it was suffocating. Fiancé, Isaac said. He did not look at her. He was staring at the open door. I had to, Ruth whispered. She was trembling, the adrenaline leaving her body, replaced by a deep, shaking cold. He had the papers. He would have taken the cabin. I would have nothing, nowhere to go. You did what you had to do, he said. He walked to the door and shut it, plunging the room back into gloom. Isaac, you played a strong hand. Ruth, Silas would have been proud. She flinched as if he had struck her. That is not fair. Fair, he turned on her. His face was not the face of the man who had kissed her with such sad forgiveness. It was the face of the man from Wyoming, hard, angry. You think any of this is fair? You stood there and you claimed me, like a stray dog. You put a brand on me to protect your property. I protected us. You protected yourself, he shot back. You used me. You used my name. You used the fact that I'm standing here with a gun on my hip to scare them off. What am I to you, Ruth? The man who fixes the roof? The hired gun? The fiancé? The word was a sneer. I don't know what you are, she cried, all her fear and tension exploding into rage. You're the man who started the fire. You're the man who tied me to a bed. You're a stranger. I wasn't a stranger last night, he said, his voice dropping, dangerous and low. I wasn't a stranger when you put your mouth on mine. I wasn't a stranger when you tied my hands. Stop it. She put her hands over her ears. Stop it. I don't want this. I don't want a fiancé. I don't want a husband. She backed away from him until she hit the far wall. Do you understand me? She spat, the words coming out in a torrent. I just got free of one. I will not be Mrs. Holt or Mrs. anything. I just want to be left alone. I don't want to be property. Her words hit him harder than the sheriff's threats. He had been so focused on his own wound, the fear of being used, of being a temporary shelter, that he had not seen hers. She was a wild animal, terrified of the trap, and he had just slammed the door. So that's it, he said, his voice flat, all the anger gone, replaced by a familiar, hollow emptiness. I'm just a convenience. A man to get you through the storm. A man to scare off the law. And when you're safe, I'm supposed to just ride on. I didn't say that, she whispered, her anger deflating, seeing the deep, old pain in his eyes. You didn't have to, he said. He turned his back on her. He picked up the axe. The lie holds till tomorrow. Then I'll be gone. You can tell them I died, or you can tell them the truth. I don't care." He stalked out of the cabin, leaving the door open. Ruth slid down the wall and sat on the cold floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She had won. She had saved her cabin, and she had just driven away the only person in the world who knew her, the only person who had ever seen her. The silence was absolute. She could not even hear him chopping wood. Then a new sound. It was not the wind. It was not an animal. It was a tapping, a dripping. It grew louder, a patter, and then a roar. A sudden, unseasonable cloudburst. The last of the snow was melting, and the sky opened up. A cold, driving spring rain hammered the cabin roof. She heard Isaac curse. Outside, the sound was muffled by the downpour. He was just standing out there. She got up. She walked to the open door. He was standing 20 yards away, by the woodpile, the axe in his hand. He was not moving. He was just standing, staring at the mountains. The rain was plastering his hair to his head, streaming down his face, soaking his wool coat. He was letting it. He was a man who had been told to leave. He was a man with nowhere to go. "Isaac!" she yelled over the rain. He did not turn. "Isaac, come inside. You'll freeze. It's a cold rain." He still did not move. She could not let him stand there. She could not be the woman who sat in the warm, dry cabin while he froze. She had been that woman once. She ran out into the deluge, her thin shoes sinking into the cold mud. The rain hit her like a slap, cold and shocking. It soaked her hair, her dress, in seconds. She ran to him, grabbing his arm, his bandaged arm. "Isaac, stop it! Come inside!" He turned. His face was a mask of cold, bleak despair. "Why? So you can use me again? So I can be your fiancé for another night?" "No!" she screamed, the rain streaming down her own face, mixing with the sudden, hot tears she could no longer hold back. "Because I'm afraid." "You're not afraid of me, Ruth. You're afraid of being tied." "Yes," she shrieked, her voice breaking, a raw, animal sound. I am terrified. So why?" "Why what?" "Why did you do it?" she sobbed, pounding her fist against his chest, a weak, small blow. Why did you tie me down like that?" He grabbed her wrists, his grip biting. "What?" "That night, in the storm, you tied my hands. You anchored me. You made me feel what, Ruth?" he yelled, shaking her. "Safe. You made me feel safe. You were in control. You stopped it. You stopped us. You were good. Why would you do that? Why would you show me that if you're just like him? If you're just another man who's going to use me and leave me?" The truth was out. It was not about the lie to the sheriff. It was about the truth on the cot. He stared at her, the rain dripping from his beard. The understanding dawned on his face, washing away the anger. "Ruth," he whispered, his voice rough. I tied you because I was terrified. Not of you. I was terrified of me, of what I wanted, of what I would take from you. I'm not good. Ruth, I'm the man who throws the lamp. I'm the man who destroys things." "I'm not something to be destroyed," she cried. "I know," he roared, pulling her against him. He wrapped his arms around her, crushing her to his body. "That's why I did it. That's why I couldn't." They were standing in the middle of a downpour, two drowned rats, clinging to each other. They were both shivering, their bodies shaking with cold and with the violence of their emotions. He was kissing her hair, his face buried in her neck. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry. I'm not leaving. I'm not leaving you. You're so cold, she chattered, her teeth knocking together. So are you, he said. He lifted her, one-armed, his bandaged arm pinned. He lifted her off her feet and carried her back to the cabin. He kicked the door shut. They stood in the center of the room, in a growing puddle of mud and rainwater. They were shaking so violently they could barely stand. The argument was gone. The fear was gone. There was only the cold and the need. His eyes were dark, locked on hers. He did not ask. He did not speak. His cold, fumbling fingers went to the top button of her sodden dress. Her hands came up. They were blue with cold. They went to the buttons of his shirt. We have to, she whispered, get warm. The wet clothes were a prison. They tore at them. Buttons popped, seams ripped. The sodden wool and linen fell to the floor, piece by heavy piece, until they were standing naked in the gloom. The cold was agonizing. It was a skin of ice. The bed, he said. It was not a request. He pushed her toward the cot, onto the rough wool blankets. She fell back, shivering. He came down over her. He was not the gentle, wounded man. He was not the hesitant confessor. He was the storm. He was a force of nature, as raw and as cold and as desperate as the rain outside. He covered her body with his. He was a shock of heat and ice. This was not the kiss of forgiveness. This was not the night of the binding. There were no ropes. There were no thongs. His mouth was on hers, hard, demanding. It was not a kiss. It was a claiming. It was a promise. I am here. I am not leaving. Her hands were free. She did not push him away. She wrapped her arms around his back, her nails digging into his skin. She pulled him closer, deeper. She was meeting his desperation with her own. This was not love. As the preacher spoke of it, this was survival. This was two broken, outcast souls finding the only shelter left in the world. Each other. It was clumsy. It was raw. It was painful. And it was perfect. It was the sound of the rain hammering the roof. It was the smell of him, all pine and man and rain. It was the feel of his skin, rough and hot, against hers. It was the release of 4 years of cold, of loneliness, of being the unclean woman. It was the release of a lifetime of running, of being the killer. He was inside her, and he was home. She was under him, and she was free. They lay tangled for a long time, the rain softening to a steady drumbeat. The shivering stopped. The cabin was filled with the sound of their breathing, harsh and ragged. He was heavy on top of her, but she did not feel crushed. She felt anchored, for the first time, without any ropes at all. He brushed the wet hair from her face, his touch, at last, gentle. Ruth, he whispered. She could not speak. She just tightened her arms around his back, holding on, as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had tried to wash her away. The next morning, the rain had passed. The world was scoured clean, the air cold and sharp. They woke on the narrow cot, tangled in the wool blankets, their bodies sore, their minds quiet. The shame that Ruth had expected to feel was not there. The fear Isaac had felt, of his own capacity for ruin, was gone. There was only a still, cold resolve. They dressed in silence, moving around each other with a new, quiet economy. They were no longer two strangers. They were a single unit, bound by confessions, by violence, and by the shared warmth of the night. Brody gave us until sundown tomorrow, Ruth said, her voice flat as she rebuilt the fire. The lie won't hold, Isaac said. He was checking his pistol, his movements methodical. Grimes won't let it. He'll press. Brody will have to act. I know. She poured coffee, her hand steady. He took the tin cup from her. Their fingers brushed. It was a simple, domestic touch, and it held more power than the desperation of the night before. I've been running since Wyoming, Ruth, he said, looking into the black coffee. Before that, from other places. I'm tired of it. She looked at him, at his battered face, his bandaged arm, the new deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes. I've been hiding, she said. Hiding is just running in place. I'm tired of it too. The decision was made, unspoken. It was the only one left. I'll saddle my horse, Isaac said. And your mare. Where are we going? To town. He met her gaze. The fear was still there, in both of them, but it was a shared fear now. To the sheriff. I'm done letting Grimes and his kind write the story. I'm done letting them hunt you. Isaac, she whispered, her hand going to his arm. They'll hang you for the fire. For Silas. He put his hand over hers. Maybe, but they'll hang me for the truth. Not for a lie, and I won't. I won't run and leave you here. I won't be the man who runs away. She nodded. A single, sharp movement. She understood. This was not just about the cabin. It was about standing on solid ground, for the first time in either of their lives. The ride to town was long. The world was a mess of mud and melting snow. They rode side by side, two outcasts, headed for a judgment they had both spent years avoiding. The town was just as they had left it, a single, muddy street dominated by the saloon and the sheriff's office. People stopped. They stared. Mrs. Ruth Calder, the Black Widow, riding bold as brass next to the big, armed stranger. The whispers followed them like a trail of dust. They dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. They did not tie the horses. They walked straight inside. Sheriff Brody was at his desk, his boots up, chewing on a cold cigar. He looked up, his eyes narrowing in surprise when they walked in. Reverend Gideon was with him, sitting in the corner, a Bible in his lap. Well, Brody grunted, swinging his boots to the floor. The happy couple. Come to set a date? The Reverend here is available. No, Isaac said. He stood in the center of the room, his coat pushed back, his hand nowhere near his gun. He was not a threat. He was a statement. Ruth stood beside him. We've come to stop the paperwork, Isaac said. Brody's eyes went flat. What's that mean? There is no marriage, Sheriff, Ruth said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the small, silent room. I lied. I lied to keep my home, because I was afraid. Brody stood up slowly. You admit that? You lied to an officer of the law? She did. Isaac cut in, his voice a low rumble. She lied to save her life. Now I'm here to tell the truth. I'm the man you want, not her. Brody and the Reverend exchanged a look. Want for what? Holt? 4 years ago, Isaac said, his voice clear. The fire at the Calder Ranch, the one that killed Silas. The Reverend sat up straight. Brody's hand moved near his own pistol. I said it. The confession hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Ruth gripped her hands together, but she did not flinch. You confess? Brody said, his mind clearly struggling to catch up. You're confessing to the murder of Silas Calder. No, Isaac said. I'm confessing to the fire. It wasn't murder. It was a fight. Silas and his men. Jed Grimes was one. They cornered me in the livery. They'd followed me from the saloon. They were going to kill me. I threw a lamp to get away. I didn't know Silas was still in the barn. I ran. He's telling the truth, Sheriff, Ruth said, stepping forward. I was there. I was in the shed. Silas. He had me locked in. He was going to kill me. The fire. It saved me. Brody stared from one to the other. The door to the office was open. A small crowd was gathering on the boardwalk, listening. This is madness. Reverend Gideon sputtered, standing up. This woman she's clearly been coerced. She's unstable. And this gunman. She's been coerced by no one, Isaac said, his voice rising, strong enough for the crowd outside to hear. "You want the truth? Ask Jed Grimes. He was there. He was one of them. Ask him why Silas really owed him $500. He told me it was a gambling debt," Brody said, frowning. "It was no debt," Ruth's voice cracked, but she did not stop. The shame was burning her, but she spoke anyway. It was the price. Silas, he'd sold me to a merchant from Virginia City for $500. That was the note Grimes had. It was the bill of sale for me." A collective, sharp intake of breath came from the crowd on the boardwalk. This was a horror they understood. This was worse than a fire. "That's a lie," a voice roared. Jed Grimes was pushing through the crowd. His face was blotched and red with fury. "She's a witch! She's lying! She got him to do it! She wanted Silas dead!" "Is it a lie, Jed?" Isaac called, his voice booming. "Were you there? Did you hold me while Silas hit me? Did you know he was selling his own wife like cattle?" The crowd turned, their eyes moving from Ruth, the widow, to Grimes, the creditor. Grimes stammered. "She's telling the truth." The voice was small, cracked with age. An old woman, Martha Sweeney, who lived on the creek, pushed her way to the front. She was trembling, a shawl clutched in her hands. "Martha, stay out of this," Gideon warned. "No," the old woman said, looking at Ruth with tears in her eyes. "I'm done staying out of it. I'm done being quiet. I saw him. I saw Silas. He beat her. I saw her 2 summers ago, down by the water. Her face—" Martha choked on a sob. He'd used a belt. He was a monster. We all knew it. We all just looked away. We let her be, unclean, because we were afraid." The silence that followed was absolute. The town's judgment, so solid for 4 years, crumbled. The whispers stopped. The looks of suspicion turned to a slow, dawning shame. And then they turned to a cold, hard fury, directed at Jed Grimes. Grimes looked at the faces. He saw no allies. He saw only condemnation. You'll all hang for this," he spat, and then he turned and shoved his way back through the crowd, retreating to the dark sanctuary of his saloon. Brody watched him go. He was a man in a hard position. He looked at Isaac. He looked at Ruth, now being comforted by Martha Sweeney. "Halt," Brody said, his voice tired. I got your confession. I have to lock you up. For the fire, I don't have a choice." Isaac looked at Ruth. He saw the tears, but he also saw the women around her. She was not alone. Not anymore. He nodded. "I'm not running." He unbuckled his gun belt and handed it, "but first, to the sheriff." "Put him in the cell," Brody said to his deputy. And for God's sake, ma'am, get her some coffee. And, Martha, thank you." They locked Isaac in the small, cold cell at the back of the office. Ruth stayed, watching him through the bars, until Martha pulled her away. "Come, child. You're safe now. He's safe. It's over." But Ruth knew it was not over. Grimes was not a man who just walked away. Night fell. Ruth was at Mrs. Jensen's small house at the edge of town, refusing to go back to the cabin. She was too afraid of what Grimes would do, and she would not leave the town while Isaac was in it. In the saloon, Grimes was drinking, surrounded by 3 of his men. They were the last loyal to Silas's memory, or rather, his money. "She's bewitched 'em all," Grimes snarled, slamming his whiskey glass down. "That land, that cabin, it's mine. The paper says so." "The paper don't mean nothing now, Jed." One of his men said, They think she's a saint." She ain't a saint, Grimes growled. She's a witness, and so is he, and that cabin, that's the prize. He smiled, a slow, ugly expression. If there's no cabin, there's no claim. The land just reverts, and if there's no widow. He stood up. Get the kerosene and torches. We're finishing what Silas started. In the sheriff's office, Brody was watching the saloon. He'd seen Grimes's men. He was not a fool. He walked back to the cell. Isaac was standing, his hands on the bars. He's going for her, isn't he? Isaac said. He's going for the cabin. Brody said, she's at Jensen's. She's safe. She won't be. Not when she sees the smoke. Not when she thinks She won't let it go. It's her home. Brody chewed his mustache. He was a lawman. But he was also a man who'd just seen a town soul turn. This is a hell of a mess, Holt. Let me out, Isaac said. I can't. You confessed. Let me out, Isaac said again, his voice a low, dangerous command. You know what's right. He's not just going to burn a house. He's going to kill a woman who's already been through hell. You let me out. I'll handle my affairs, and I'll be back. I give you my word. Brody looked at him for a long, hard minute. He saw a man who was not running. He saw a man who was running toward something. He unlocked the cell door. He handed Isaac his gun belt. I'm taking a walk down the street, Brody said, not looking at him. To check the doors. It'll take me 10 minutes. What happens while I'm gone? I can't be responsible for... Thank you, Sheriff, Isaac said, strapping the gun on. Go out the back, and Holt, don't make me regret this. Isaac was gone. Slipping into the alley, moving fast. Ruth, at Mrs. Jensen's, was at the window. She saw the 4 men ride out of the saloon. They were not riding slow. They were riding hard, north, toward the cabin. No, she whispered. No, he can't. Ruth, child, stay here, Mrs., Jensen cried. But Ruth was already out the door. She was not the woman who had hidden. She grabbed her mare and mounted, riding bareback, faster than she had ever ridden, cutting through the dark. Her only thought, my home. She got there first. She saw the cabin, dark and silent under the moon. She ran inside, her heart pounding. She lit a lamp, her hands shaking. She looked around. This was hers. Silas had not beaten it out of her. Grimes would not burn it out of her. She found Silas's old shotgun, a heavy 12-gauge. She checked it, loaded. She stood by the window and waited. She heard them, the sound of horses, the curse of drunk men. Look, Grimes's voice. Lamps on. The witch is home. Makes it easier. Jed, let's just ride her out. Take the cabin. One man slurred. No, we burn it. Burn it all. It's the only way to be clean of it. She heard the splash of kerosene against the front wall. Her blood ran cold. She was in the fire again. Whoosh! The front of the cabin exploded in flame. The heat was instant, pushing her back. Come on out, widow, Grimes laughed, a high, thin sound. Come out and die. The smoke was thick, acrid. She was coughing, backing away. The door was a sheet of fire. She was trapped. She was going to die here, just as Silas had. Crash! The back window splintered, frame and all. Ruth! Isaac. He was scrambling through, his gun in his hand. He was covered in sweat and dirt. Isaac, how, Brody, he let me go. He grabbed her arm. The cabin was an inferno. The roar was deafening. We have to go, now, out the back. No, she screamed, her voice raw. She was not that woman, not anymore. This is my home. She raised the shotgun, aimed it straight through the burning front door, and pulled the trigger. A scream from outside, a man's curse. "Damn it! Ruth!" Isaac yelled, pulling her. "We live! That's how we win!" He shoved her, bodily, through the broken window. She tumbled out into the cold, muddy yard. Isaac landed beside her. "There they are!" Grimes yelled. He and his 2 remaining men were circling the burning cabin, their faces lit by the orange flames. Ruth was on her knees, scrambling. Isaac stood up. He pushed Ruth behind him. A solid wall between her and the men. The burning cabin was at their backs, a wall of impossible heat. "Grimes!" Isaac yelled, his voice carrying over the roar of the fire. "It's over! The town knows! You're done!" "You!" Grimes shrieked, his voice cracking with rage and drink. "You're supposed to be in a cell! You ruined it! You ruined everything!" He raised his rifle. He was shaking. Isaac drew his pistol. His hand was rock steady. It was a tableau from hell. 3 men on horseback, 1 man on foot, and a woman on her knees, all lit by a funeral pyre. Grimes fired. Isaac fired at the same instant. The man to Grimes's left grunted, clutching his chest, and toppled sideways from his horse. But Grimes's shot was true. Isaac stumbled, a heavy, solid thud hitting his chest. He looked down. A dark stain was spreading. "Isaac!" Ruth screamed. Grimes was fumbling with the lever action, trying to chamber another round, his eyes wide with a killer's panic. Isaac was on one knee. He was breathing hard. He raised his pistol, his arms shaking, not from fear but from the effort. He took aim. He fired. Grimes screamed, the rifle clattering to the ground as he clutched a shattered shoulder. The last man, the one Ruth's shotgun blast had hit in the arm, was already gone, galloping in terror into the darkness. Grimes, howling in pain and rage, scrambled to get his horse. He managed to pull himself into the saddle and fled, a broken, wounded animal. Silence. Only the crackle and roar of the cabin, its roof now collapsing, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. Ruth scrambled to Isaac. He was on his back, in the mud. He was not looking at the fire. He was looking at her. "Isaac! Oh, God! No! No! His chest was a ruin. It was a bad hit. She could see the dark, frothy blood, a lung shot. She pressed her hands to the wound, but it was useless. The blood just poured over her fingers. "Ruth," he coughed, and blood flecked his lips. "No, don't talk, don't talk. Save your strength." She was sobbing, the words catching in her throat. "Looks like," he whispered, a grim, small smile touching his mouth. "I'm good at starting fires, after all." "Don't, please don't." He reached up, his hand shaking, and touched her face. His fingers were bloody, leaving a streak on her cheek. You're free, Ruth. No more running. You're free." I don't want to be free," she choked. "I want you." He looked at her. The firelight was dancing in his eyes, just as it had in the barn, all those years ago. But this time, it was not fierce. It was peaceful. "Ruth," he whispered. One last breath. His hand, the one on her cheek, went slack. It fell to his chest. His eyes, fixed on her, lost their focus. They went glassy, staring past her, at the flames. He was still. A small, strangled sound came from Ruth's throat. "Isaac! Isaac!" She shook his shoulder. "Isaac, no, please, Isaac!" She put her ear to his chest, to the bloody hole, listening, praying. Nothing, no breath, no heartbeat. He was gone. Ruth sat back on her heels. The mud, the blood, the heat, it all disappeared. There was only the empty, silent man in front of her. She threw her head back, and a scream tore from her throat. It was not a sound of fear. It was a sound of absolute, final desolation. A sound of a world ending. She collapsed onto his chest, her body racked with sobs, clinging to the man who had saved her, the man she had loved, as the last of her home burned to embers beside them in the cold Montana night. Ruth's scream was a knife. It cut through the roar of the fire and the sudden, awful silence of the night. She was on her knees in the mud, her hands slick with a blood that was not her own, a blood that was cooling too fast. He was gone. She had felt it. She had felt the last stuttering beat of his heart under her ear, the last breath rattle in his chest. He was still. He was dead. The heat from the cabin was a physical thing, a solid wall that pushed against her back, blistering her skin. But she did not move. She knelt, rocking, a low animal sound tearing from her throat, her eyes fixed on his, open and glassy in the firelight. Then, hoofbeats, heavy and fast. Sheriff Brody slid his horse to a stop, the animal rearing in fear of the flames. His face was a mask of shock, lit by the inferno. He saw the dead man by the woodpile, shot clean. He saw the cabin, its roof collapsing, a volcano of sparks. And he saw Ruth, a specter in the mud, covered in blood, howling over a body. "My God," he breathed. He swung down, his pistol drawn. "Mrs. Calder, get back! The whole thing's coming down!" He grabbed her arm, his grip hard, trying to pull her away from the falling, burning timbers. "He's dead," she choked, pointing, her voice a raw, shredded thing. "He's Isaac. He's dead. Grimes shot him." Brody hauled her back, shielding her with his own body as a rafter fell where she had been kneeling. He looked. "Ma'am, we have to. Where is he? Where's Holt?" "Right there," she screamed, pointing at the patch of bloody mud. "He's right there. I was holding him." Brody stared. The ground was slick, a dark, terrible pool of blood and mud. He saw Isaac's pistol, dropped, half sunk, but there was no body. "Ruth," Brody said, his voice gentle, his eyes scanning the tree line, his gun still up. There's no one there." She tore free from his grip, falling to her knees, her hands plunging into the bloody ooze, as if she could pull him back from the earth itself. He was here. I held him. He died. Brody was confused. The woman was mad with grief. Had the fire. "Ma'am, maybe the flames." "No!" she shrieked. She looked at her hands, gleaming red. This was real. He was real. Suddenly, from the dark woods to the north, an arrow buried itself in the ground, thunking into the mud not 10 feet from them. It was not a warning. It was a marker, a claim. Brody swore, grabbing Ruth and dragging her toward his horse. "Get on, now! That's Crow!" "What about—" she cried, looking back at the empty, bloody place, at the grave that was not a grave. "He's gone, ma'am," Brody said, his voice grim as he mounted behind her. "One way or another, the fire, or them. He's gone." He spurred the horse, galloping away from the inferno, back toward the town. Ruth did not look back. She just stared into the dark trees, her mind repeating a single, impossible fact. He was dead, but they had taken him. The weeks that followed were a cold fog. Brody brought her back to town, a ghost in a bloody dress. The town's shame, ignited by Martha Sweeney, turned to pity. They took her in, Mrs. Jensen gave her a room. The women brought her broth and clean clothes. But Ruth could not stay. She was not one of them. She was the woman of the fire. She was the woman of the gun. The looks of pity felt just as heavy as the looks of scorn. She took the supplies they offered, a canvas tent, a bag of flour, a single wool blanket. She walked out of town, past the whispering houses, and she did not stop until she reached the creek, a quarter-mile from the ruin of her home. She pitched the tent. She lived. She was a new creature. The teacher from Helena was gone. The frightened widow of Silas Calder was gone. The desperate lover of Isaac Holt was gone. All that was left was a woman who knew how to survive. She hunted. She set snares, just as she had watched him do. She learned to read the mud for tracks. She was silent, and she was hard. She did not know if he was alive. She had felt his heart stop. She had felt his last breath. But the woods had taken him. This one. Impossible. Agonizing spark of a question kept her sane. He was dead, but his body was not in the ground. One day, in late April, when the last of the snow had turned the world to a cold, wet bog, she was checking her snares. She heard a sound, thin and reedy. On the wind, it was not a bird, it was a child, crying. She found her by the wreckage of a settler's wagon, its wheels broken, half sunk in the mud of a river crossing. The wagon was shattered, the family gone, drowned in the spring flood, or taken by the cold. All that remained was a girl, maybe 4 years old, huddled under a piece of oilcloth. She was thin as a stray dog, her eyes huge and dark with a terror so deep it had gone silent. Ruth stood, looking at the child. The child stared back. 2 outcasts, 2 survivors, 2 people left behind. Ruth held out her hand. It was not the soft hand of a teacher. It was brown, calloused, and scarred. "Come on," Ruth said, her first words in what felt like a month. The girl, seeing something in Ruth's eyes that was not pity, but recognition, slowly crept out and took her hand. Ruth brought her back to the tent. She washed her face in the creek. She fed her the last of her rabbit stew, which the girl ate with a desperate animal hunger. That night, they slept under the one blanket, 2 small, breathing bodies in the vast, cold darkness. Ruth was no longer a ghost. She was a protector. Spring finally came. The world turned from brown to a pale, hopeful green. The town, needing to affirm its own survival, held its first spring market. Ruth came. She had the child, Sarah, to feed. She had mended some tools from the wrecked wagon, and she had a few good rabbit pelts. She needed flour. She needed salt. She walked down the muddy main street, Sarah holding tight to her hand. The townspeople looked. They nodded. The whispers were gone. This was not the Black Widow. This was not the town pariah. This was Mrs. Calder, the woman who had faced Jed Grimes, the woman who had lost everything, twice, and was still standing. She made her trades at the general store, her voice low and direct. She strapped the small bag of flour to her back. She was turning to leave, to take Sarah and go back to the woods, when she felt it. A stillness, a sudden shift in the air. She looked up. He was standing across the street, his shoulder leaning against the wall of the smithy. He was not a ghost. He was thinner, much thinner. His face was gaunt, the cheekbones sharp. He wore a simple linen shirt she did not recognize. A long, puckered, angry red scar ran from his collarbone, disappearing under the cloth. It was the wound, the one she had pressed her hands to. But he was standing. He was breathing. And he was looking at her. His eyes, they were the same clear, steady, gentle blue. The same eyes that had watched her in the storm. The same eyes that had looked at her with such sad forgiveness. The bag of flour slipped from her grasp. It landed in the mud with a soft thud. She did not notice. Sarah, frightened by the tall stranger, hid behind Ruth's skirt. Ruth took one step, then another. The noise of the market, the bargaining, the laughter of children. It all faded. It became a distant roar, like the fire, like the wind. She crossed the street. He did not move. He waited for her. She stopped. A foot of air, a universe of mud and memory between them. She could smell him. Not wood smoke, something cleaner, herbs and pine. "You," she breathed. Her voice was a dry croak, a sound of disbelief. I felt you die. I was close, he said. His voice was the same, that low, soft gravel. I was very close. She had to know he was real, that he was not a fever dream. She raised her hand, the one that was still in her mind, tied to the bedframe. He raised his hand was scarred, too, from the fire, from the work, from the wound. Their palms touched. Not a grip, not a plea, not a claim, just a touching, skin to skin. It was not the desperate, cold touch of the cot. It was not the hungry, violent kiss in the rain. It was a simple, profound fact. He was warm. He was alive. All the questions, how, why, where, they vanished in that touch. But he answered them anyway, his eyes never leaving hers. "The crow," he said. "They were watching from the trees. They saw the fight." "Why?" she whispered. "Years ago, Wyoming, I came across one of their boys. He was hurt, a trap. I cut him loose. I let him go. I didn't kill him. They remembered." He looked down at the scar on his chest. "They took me. I was gone. I was dead, by your reckoning. But their medicine man, he was stubborn. He did not agree. He had been in their camp, high in the mountains, all these weeks. He had floated in a world of pain and herbs and fever dreams. He had only been strong enough to walk for a week." He looked at her hand. In his, he closed his fingers around it, a firm, solid grip. "I came, as soon as I could stand." She looked at him, and the tears she had not shed. Not for the cabin, not for herself, only for him. They came. They welled up and ran down her face. "I thought you were dead," she whispered, the words finally breaking free. "I know," he said. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture of simple, profound respect. "I am sorry I was late." He saw the small child peering from behind Ruth's skirt. He did not ask. He just looked at Ruth and at the girl, and he understood. He knelt, his knees cracking. "Hello," he said to Sarah, his voice gentle. "The girl," seeing the kindness in his eyes, the same kindness she had seen in Ruth's, slowly stepped out. They did not go back to the creek. They walked, the three of them, north, past the line of trees. They stood before the ruin. It was not a cabin. It was a grave, a single, tall stone chimney, standing like a monument, a foundation of charred, black logs. Ruth looked at it, at the place where she had been a wife, a prisoner, a lover. "It is gone," she said. "No," Isaac said. He walked to the chimney. He put his hand on the stones. They were cold, but they were solid. "The stone is good, the foundation. Some of it is good." He looked at her, his eyes clear. "It is a start." He turned and looked at the pile of burned logs from the roof. He bent, hissing with the pull of the new scar, and picked up a heavy, half-burned timber. "This one," he said. "We can use this one." Ruth looked at him. She looked at the ruin. She looked at the small child holding her hand. This was not a place for outcasts. This was a place for survivors. This was a place for people no one else wanted. She walked to the foundation and picked up a stone that had fallen. It was heavy. "This one, too," she said. They began. It was the hardest work they had ever known. They lived in the tent. They had no money, no help, only their hands. He cut new logs, his wounded arm now strong. She learned to mix chinking, to haul stone. Sarah, the child, gathered sticks for the fire. The town watched. After a week, Martha Sweeney rode out. She brought a hot stew. She brought a bag of nails. "The town took up a collection," she said gruffly, not meeting their eyes. We do not want folks living in tents. It is not proper." Sheriff Brody rode out. He watched Isaac set a log, Grimes. He never came back. Brody said, figured the cold. Or a wolf. Got him. His men are gone. The debt is gone. The land is yours. Mrs. Calder. It is Ruth, she said, not looking up from her work. Ruth? Brody nodded. He looked at Isaac. You were supposed to come back to my cell. For the fire. I am still here, Sheriff, Isaac said, wiping sweat from his face. I am not going anywhere. Brody nodded again. He looked at the new, strong walls. I reckon that fire was paid for by the new one. He turned his horse and rode away. The cabin rose. It was not the same cabin. It was smaller. It was stronger. It was built not by a rich man's crew, but by two people's hands. It was a fortress. It was a home. The first snow of the next winter was on the peaks, but the cabin was finished. It was a cold, bright afternoon. Inside, it was warm. A fire crackled in the hearth, the new hearth, built on the old, solid stones. Sarah was asleep on a small pallet, a doll made of corn husks in her hand. Isaac sat at the table. He was oiling his rifle, his movements slow, patient. The scar on his chest was a pale, white line against his skin. Ruth was on the cot. It was a new cot, built by his hands. The frame was strong, made of pine. He looked over at her. She was quiet. She was smiling, a slow, private smile. What is it? He asked, his voice a low rumble of comfort. I was just remembering, she said. Remembering what? The storm. He stopped his work, watching her. She sat up. Her eyes were full of a light he had never seen there before. Not fear, not hunger, but a deep, playful, absolute love. She reached down, picking up a leather thong he used for his bootlaces. He watched, his hands still. Slowly, her eyes locked on his. She took her own left wrist. She looped the leather around it, and with a deft, sure movement, she tied it to the bedframe. She did the same with her right. She lay back, her arms spread, anchored to the bed she had helped build. She was bound, and she was, in that moment, the freest woman in Montana. She smiled, her voice a low, warm whisper that filled the quiet room. Now, take it off. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please share your thoughts and your location in the comments below. Do not forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel.